Alright, hello everyone and welcome to Phase 1 of your Lab01 assignment. Lab01 focuses on an introduction to web development. Web development is a field of computer science that focuses on creating content and applications for the internet. Specifically, Lab01 is all about HTML and CSS, which are two building blocks for creating websites and web pages. So what is HTML and CSS? Well, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and this is the language that we're going to use to create the overall structure for our website's content. Now, we're going to see that that structure on its own doesn't always look the way we want it to, and that's why we have something called CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets. And basically what CSS is for is it's a completely separate language that lets us style our skeleton that we created in HTML so that we can get the results that we want. We can make it look how we want it to. Now, the way that our workflow is going to be is that we're going to create our structure in an HTML file, and then we're going to connect that structure to a CSS file, and then we can start styling it to get the web page that we want. So now let's talk about browsers. A browser is a program that you use to access the internet. It does a lot of things behind the scenes to make that possible, and one of those jobs is that it renders HTML and CSS files and presents them on the screen to create the websites that we all know. Now, browsers tend to render things differently sometimes, and the reason for this is because they're made by different companies and they use different code, and we'll see an example of this later on in the demo. And it's just something to keep in mind when we're creating websites, because we want everybody using our website to have the same experience no matter what browser they use. Down here you might see a couple of browsers that are very popular. So in this demo I will be using Google Chrome, but feel free to use any of the other options. I will be also showing what the website looks like in Firefox and Safari, just so you can get used to the idea of testing across different browsers. So let's take a closer look at how HTML works. The primary idea behind HTML is this content structure called tags. Tags is how we organize and define our content, and they can be very expansive, so they can contain other tags. Those are called nested tags. They may just contain some text. It all just depends. And because tags are so flexible, that's why we have a ton of different tags depending on what you want. So there's tags for videos, there's tags for paragraphs and lists. It all just depends on what you need, and you can do the research to find the exact tags that you want. Below down here we've got a couple of examples of tags. So this is a tag for creating a paragraph on the screen. This is a tag for creating a large header text. And down here we've got a tag for creating a link to an external website. So this is just a small selection of a wide variety that's out there. So a little bit more on tags. Tags tend to follow a pretty regular structure. There's always an opening tag shown right here, followed by a closing tag. So the opening tag is going to look like an angle bracket followed by the name of the tag. So for a paragraph tag, it's a lowercase p. If you don't know what the name for the tag that you want is, you can usually look it up. It's very self-explanatory most of the time. Then we finish things off with a closing angle bracket. After that comes the content. So in this case, we just have some text, but remember, tags can be inside of other tags. It all just depends on what we're using. After your content, you've got your closing tag. So pretty similar to the opening tag, but notice there's a slash right here, and that's what denotes that it's a closing tag. Think of it kind of like parentheses. You have opening parentheses and closing parentheses, and you always want them to match up. So you should never have content that is outside of a tag, and you should always have both an opening and closing tag to maintain a regular structure. Now, the exception to the opening tag and closing tag rule is a small subset of tags called self-terminating tags. So an image would be one of them. You can see here that we have an image tag denoted with the name img. You define where that image comes from, so this can be an image on your computer or it can be an image from the internet. And then when you want to finish off this tag, you just put a slash and a closing angle bracket. And once again, this doesn't apply to all tags, just a very small selection, and we'll go over this more in the demo. Now let's go into detail about how CSS works. The main idea behind CSS is something called selectors. When we want to style our HTML elements, we want to be specific about where we're styling or which particular tag we're styling. And that is exactly what CSS selectors allow us to do. They give us a way to access particular tags so that we can selectively apply styles to them. So you can see we have an example of this right here. I've modified our paragraph tag to include a class. So you can see all I did was add class equals, and in this case I put my text, but this can be whatever you want your class to be called. And I've added this all to my opening tag inside of my HTML. Now we can access this particular paragraph tag using the class selector. So let's go into more detail about what these selectors are. There's a couple of different kinds. The one that we just talked about is a class selector right here. And that lets us apply the same styles to a group of elements. So let's imagine that there were a bunch of paragraph tags and they all had class equals my text. And you want all of these paragraph tags to look the same. We can apply a selection of styles to just this class, and that same group of styles will apply to all paragraphs that belong to this class. And that helps us write really efficient stylings because we don't need to style each paragraph one by one. Now, on the other hand, if you have a unique element that there's only one of, that's when you would want to use an ID. And this is how we can style a single element. You want to make sure that you never have two elements that share the same ID. Lastly, there's tag selectors, and this is a really broad one, and it helps us style all members of a particular tag. So for example, if you wanted to change the font size for every single paragraph tag, that is what a tag selector would be used for. I want to make it clear though that we can actually combine selectors. So you could have a class for a tag and an ID. It all just depends on how you want to mix and match your CSS properties, and we'll get to see some of this in the demo. Here's a look at some CSS in action. Up here I've got a paragraph tag that would be in our HTML file. The tag has a class name of my text. Note that we have a dash in our class name. Unlike with Python, we can have dashes in our CSS selectors. For best practice, selectors should start with a letter and can contain other letters, numbers, dashes, or underscores. Down here, we have the selector in our CSS file that we've accessed. Don't worry about the period in front of the selector for now. We're going to explain that in the demo. Each of these lines inside these curly braces is called a property, and they let us style our element. Properties should each end with a semicolon. There's hundreds of properties and there's hundreds of tags, and you're not expected to memorize any of them. So we've also linked some helpful learning tools and resources in the Lab01 PDF to help you find what you're looking for. Now it's time to actually get to phase one of the lab. So we're going to be creating this clone of the Google homepage, and some of the components will work. Like for example, this menu we have up here, all of these links are going to work. We're also going to link this profile picture, which you can customize by the way, to another HTML page that we'll create, and you will be working on that in phase two. That's where you have a bit more creative control. We're also going to create this search section down here, and you're going to be able to type into the search box, but it's not going to actually pull up any auto-completed results. You're not going to be able to click this search button, and you're not going to click the I'm feeling lucky button. They're just there for show. And that's because we don't exactly have enough time right now to recreate a multi-billion-dollar company. We're just going to focus on getting things laid out to look the way we want them to. So there's a couple of things that we're going to need in this lab. First of all, we're going to need a text editor. In the past, we've been using idle for our Python files, which is great, but idle is just for Python, and right now we're working with something completely separate, so we're going to need a program that can let us write HTML and CSS files. And that's something a text editor would be great for. It's a program that lets us save text in a bunch of different formats like .html and .css. So I have a couple of recommendations. Visual Studio Code and Atom are both great. They're both free and they will never ask you for any money. In this demo, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. That's my personal preference. Here's the icon for it right here. And we're going to include the links where you can download both of these programs in the PDF for this lab. We're also going to need the lab01.zip file from Canvas, and this is going to contain some starter files to help us get used to the structure of our website, and it's also going to include some of those images that we're going to be using, like the profile picture and the logo. So with all that being said, let's get started. Now at any time in this demo, if you feel like the video is going too fast, feel free to pause and catch up. Also, we've got a table of contents listed in the description of this video so that you can pick up at any time. Okay, so I'm on my desktop and I've got the lab01.zip folder right here. We can extract it by double-clicking the folder. Okay. And if you're on a Windows computer, you can do the same thing by right-clicking the zip and then clicking Extract All. So now that we have this folder, let's open up Visual Studio Code. And then we can open up our entire folder by clicking the Open Folder button. So I'll do that, and I will find the Lab01 folder. Let's go ahead and take a look around. We've got an index.html file, we've got a blank styles.css file, and we also have some images in the image folder. Let's go through the index.html file. This is the HTML file where the entire structure for our Google clone will be. The first line tells us what kind of file the browser is looking at. So in this case, it's telling the browser, hey, I'm looking at an HTML file. Next, we've got this HTML tag right here. And notice that everything else is inside of this HTML tag. That's the norm. All HTML pages only have one HTML tag, and that's the thing that holds everything. There's two main tags inside of this HTML. The first is the head tag. This is where you declare a bunch of information about the site, but you don't actually put any of the content in the site inside of the head tag. That's what this is for, the body. The body tag is going to hold all of the display content on your page. Inside our head tag, we see that we have a title. Let's go ahead and change this to be your name. We'll save it. Perfect. Now, to actually see what we're doing, we need to open our HTML in a browser. To do that, let's go back to our file, and let's select to open it with a browser. So I'm going to right-click, Open With, and then I will select Google Chrome. Cool. And we can see here that we've got it open, but there's nothing on the page as expected. However, if I go up to the tab, I can see that the title has changed. So right now, it currently does say my name. Let's start by adding some content. So I'm going to close this or minimize it. And then let's open up Visual Studio Code. And now let's add some structures. So to start, let's go ahead and create our menu. Let's do this by using a div tag. A div tag is a really general purpose tag used to create a new element or define a section of the website. In this case, I'm using it to create the section for our menu. Now we want to have a bunch of links inside of our menu. So to do that, we're going to use the A tag, which was shown in the examples from before. So all you need to do is say A, and then type in some of these links. The first one is about. The next one is store. The next one is Gmail. And the last one is images. Perfect. So let's go ahead and save this. And when I go back to my browser, nothing has changed. And that's because every time you want to see the changes, you first have to save the file and then refresh in the browser. So when I refresh, I can see that it looks like I've got these links showing up right here, which is great. Now for each of these links, I want them to actually go somewhere when I click them. Right now they don't do that. So in order to make that happen, let's go back to VS Code, and we need to add an attribute to each of our A tags called an href. And an href defines where will this link take me to. So in this first case, for about, we want it to go to Google's About page. So that is just https about.google. Now we can do the rest the exact same way. So we'll say href equals https, and this one is for store.google.com. The next one is href https. This one is simply gmail.com. And the last one is kind of long. It's href equals https. And then we have www.google.com/imghp $HL equals en. Perfect. Let's go ahead and save that. Go to our browser, refresh, and now we can see that the links have underlined and turned blue. So let's go ahead and click one of them. And sure enough, it looks like this properly linked to the about.google page. So let's go back. Now at this point, the links work, but they certainly don't look how I want them to. So I think it's time that we add some CSS. But first, we need to actually link that CSS file. So to do that, we're going to have to make another change to our head tag. Let's go back to VS Code. In here, we're going to add a link tag which will actually link that CSS file. So we say link, and now the first thing we need to do is specify the rel attribute, that is rel. This tells the browser what the linked file actually is. In this case, it is a style sheet. Next, we need to specify the type of the linked file. So we say type equals, and in this case it is a text/CSS file. And lastly, we need to specify where this file is actually located. So in this case, we just say href equals, and now we specify a path to our styles. And in this case, it's just in the same folder, so we say styles.css. Then we type in a slash, and it's a self-terminating tag, so we don't need to do a separate tag to close this link. Let's go ahead and save that. Now to actually test if this link worked, we need to add some styles and see if they show up. So let's go open our styles.css file by double-clicking it, and let's start by changing the font for the entire website. So right now, it looks like Times New Roman. Let's make it something a bit softer. To actually change the font for the entire website, we're going to use a tag selector for the entire body. To do that, we simply type in the tag name and open up some curly braces. Now this is where we need to specify a property that we want to style. In this case, I want to change the font for the entire page, so this is where the font family property comes in. So font family, and I'll type in the font names that I want. So in this case, I want Arial, Helvetica, and Sans Serif. Perfect. We'll save there, add a semicolon at the end just to be safe. And now let's go ahead and refresh. And sure enough, we can see that our font has actually changed. So that means our CSS is ready to go. Now let's get to work on our menu. We know there's only going to be one menu on our entire page. So that means we can give this div for our menu an ID. And we'll set that ID equal to menu. Now let's go to our CSS and add some styles to this menu. To do that, we're going to need to use the ID selector. To select an ID, we type a hashtag followed by the name of the ID. So in this case, just menu. Then we open up our curly braces. And now let's take a look at what we actually need to do. So when I go back to Google Chrome, I can see that these links are a bit too close to the corner of the page. So let's space things out a little bit. To do that, we can use a property called padding. Padding defines how much space is between the borders of the menu and its content. So we'll say that the padding is going to be 5px, then 10px. So what does this line actually mean? Well, first of all, px stands for pixels. It is a unit of measurement for our screen. The 5 defines the padding in the vertical direction, and the 10 defines the padding in the horizontal direction. Let's save our CSS, refresh, and now we can see that our links have shifted a bit more away from the corner, which is exactly what we wanted. Now when we have a bunch of elements that we want to appear in a row, like in our menu, we can use something called flex. This is a really easy CSS system to control items that we want to show up side by side. All we need to do is change the display to flex. We don't really see much changes right now, but it'll be a lot more useful when we add our profile picture. Next, let's style each of these links. Since I want all of these links to look the same, let's give them the same class. Let's go to our HTML and add a class to this link. I'll call it menu item. And I will copy and paste this class for all of them. Great. Now we can actually use this class in our CSS by typing a period followed by the class name. So in this case, just menu item. Let's go ahead and set the font size, and we can do that by setting it to 14 pixels. We will set the color to black, and let's see how that looks. Perfect. Now, first thing I want to do is give some spacing. To create some spacing around an item, we can use a property called margin. It's similar to padding, except margin defines the spacing outside of an element, while padding defines the spacing inside of an element. However, the convention is very similar. The first number represents the vertical spacing, and in this case, I don't want any vertical spacing. And the second number is the horizontal spacing, and I'll set that to 10 pixels. And let's see how that looks. A lot better. Now, I want to get rid of this underline, but I do want the underline to show up when I put my cursor over the link. To do that, we can use something called a pseudo class, which is a style that only shows up during certain cases. In this case, we can use the hover pseudo class, which will only show a style when we're hovering our mouse over the link. To use a pseudo class, we type the CSS that we want to style, so in this case, it's still the menu item class, but then we put a colon followed by the state or the pseudo class that we want, so in this case, just hover. Now, I can set the text decoration to underline. Similarly, I want to get rid of the text decoration whenever I'm not hovering, so that will be the default styling. So I'll just set the text decoration here to be none. Let's go ahead and refresh. And now we can see that the underline is gone, but when I hover over them, all the links underline. Now let's add our profile picture. First, we'll add another menu link item. Just copy and paste this one, and I'll delete the href. This time, we don't want text to be in our link, but rather we want a picture instead. So let's delete the text and add an image tag, img. The first thing we need to define is a source, or where we're going to get this picture from. In this case, the source comes from our images folder, from a specific picture called profile.png. Next, let's specify an alt, which isn't necessary, but is good for accessibility purposes. It's a description that shows up in case the image doesn't load properly. So this can be basically anything you want. I'll just call it profile for now. Then we self-terminate this tag with a slash and a bracket. Let's see how this looks. Great, now the picture is there, but it's kind of big and it needs to be aligned. First, let's style it by giving it an ID, since there's only one profile picture. Let's say that the ID is profile pic. Now in our CSS, we can go ahead and set the size. To do that, we'll use the height and width properties. Let's set them both to 32 pixels. We can also round it and make it into a circle by using something called a border radius. This is used to normally round the corners on an element, but if we set the border radius to be half of the height or half of the width, it'll make it a full circle. Let's save it and see what we're looking at. Great, looking good. Now I notice that the elements in our menu are aligned at the top when I want them to be aligned down the middle. To fix this, we can use a flex property called align items in our CSS. We can just set align items in our menu, and we'll set it to center. This will vertically center all of the items. And when we refresh, we can see that everything is good down the middle. Now let's add a shadow when you hover over the profile picture. We can use the same pseudo-class approach from the links to accomplish this. We'll go back to our CSS and add a pseudo-class for the profile picture. This one is also a hover, so we do colon, hover, and to create a shadow, we can use the box shadow property. First, we specify the position of the shadow in the x and y direction. In this case, I want it to be centered, so I'll say 0 pixels for x and 0 pixels for y. Then we specify the blur of the shadow, so this will just be 5 pixels for now. And lastly, we need to set the color for our shadow. In this case, I'll set it to a hex color, which is hashtag C2, C2, C2. It's a light gray. If you want to mess around with colors, simply go to Google and look up color picker. From here, you can select any color, and you can see its hex code, or you can even type in a hex code to see what it looks like. As we can see, C2, C2, C2 is still that light gray. Let's save this and refresh. Now, when I hover over the profile picture, there's a very subtle shadow that shows up. Lastly, we need to add some space so that the Gmail, images, and the profile picture appear on the right side of the screen. To do this, let's add a margin to the store link in particular that will push these three links all the way to the right. To do this, we're going to have to specifically target this store link. So let's give this store link an ID. We'll go back to our HTML, and we'll add an ID to the store link. And we'll just say that it's store link. Now in our CSS, we specify store link, and we're going to add a margin right with a value of auto. This is going to push everything as far as it can. Let's see how that looks. And just like that, our menu is done. Now let's talk about linking our profile picture. First, I'm going to make a copy of the index.html file. I'll just right-click here, copy, and then Command-V or Control-V to paste. I'll rename this file to be profile.html, and I'll delete all of the content in our body tag, and I'll replace it with a header, or h1, that just says profile page, and I'll save it. Now let's go back to our index page and create a link from our profile picture to this new file that we created. We're going to need to add an href to the link that surrounds our profile picture. So we'll just say href equals, and this time we need to specify a path to our profile.html instead of a link to an external website. Since the path is the same folder, we'll just say profile.html. Let's save it and refresh. And when we click this profile, we can now see that we're brought to the separate profile page. Next, let's add our search section. We'll do what we did before, and we'll add a new div with an ID of search. Next, we need to add our logo. We'll add an image tag inside, img, and we'll specify the source for our image. This time it's under images, and the name of it is logo.png. We can also give it an alt description of just logo. We'll close that tag, and now let's see what we have. Great, so the logo shows up. Let's add some space between the menu and this search section. Let's go back to our CSS, and we'll specify a margin top for our search section. We'll use the ID of search and give it a margin top of about 120 pixels. Great, now the logo has been pushed down, but we need to size it down and center it. To size it, let's specify a width of 272 pixels for the logo. First, we're going to need to actually give this logo an ID. So we'll say that it has an ID of main logo. Then in our CSS, we can say that main logo has a width of 272 pixels. Notice we didn't specify a height. If we only specify one measurement, the CSS will automatically scale the other measurement down so that it looks the exact same. Let's refresh the page, and great, the logo is smaller. To actually center it, there's a lot of different ways we can do it, but let's use the text-align center property on our search section to take care of this. So in search, we'll say text-align center, and this will center all the text and image content inside of it. When we refresh, we can see that our logo is now in the center of our screen. Now let's add our search bar. The tag we need for this is an input tag. So let's go ahead and type in input, and we'll give it an ID so we can style it. We'll call it search bar. Input tags are self-terminating, so let's go ahead and also put a backslash and a closing bracket. Our logo and our input appear next to each other, so we need to use a break tag to separate them onto a new line. This is just br/, also self-terminating. Perfect. Now they show up on different lines. Let's start to make the search bar actually look nice. We can start by adding a height. So let's select our search bar. We'll give it a height of 34 pixels. We'll give it a font size of 17 pixels. And we'll give it some rounded corners. If we want it to be fully rounded, we have to use a border radius that is half of the height. So in this case, 17 pixels as well. We can also add a border to our search bar. Let's give it a border of 1 pixel. This is the thickness of the border, followed by solid, which defines the style of the border. In this case, we just want a solid border. And lastly, a color for the border. We're just going to use the same C2 gray color from before. Lastly, we need to add a width for our search bar. Let's just say 500 pixels for now. That's looking a lot better. However, when I type in the box, we can see that the text is really close to the edge. We can fix this using padding, which, if we recall, defines the space between the content of a tag and its borders. Let's say that the left padding left, is 20 pixels, and we'll also give the same for the padding right. Now when we refresh, we can see that there's a lot of space between the edge of the box and what we type. Lastly, let's add a little bit of space between the logo and the search bar. We can do this using a margin top on the search bar. We'll give it a margin top of 30 pixels. That's much better. And lastly, we can add a cool trick to have some default text in our search bar so that it can give us a hint of what we need to do. To do this, we go back to our HTML and we use a special property called a placeholder. This will be the text that shows up in our search bar when there's nothing there. Let's just say search with an ellipses. We refresh, and now you can see that we have some default text that disappears when we start to type. Great, now we've got a search bar that we can type in. Now, just like the profile picture, I want to add some cool shadow effects when I hover over the search bar or when I'm typing in it. We can use the same hover pseudo class from before, but there's another pseudo class just for inputs called focus, which is triggered when you're typing inside of the input. Since they both have the same styles, we can go ahead and combine these classes together. So first we'll say search bar :hover, and then to add another style group, we'll add a comma, and then search bar, focus. Now we can write the same styles for both cases. In this case, I want the exact same shadow that I used from the profile picture, so I'll just copy and paste this box shadow and put it down here. Let's save, refresh, and now when I hover over the bar, I can see I have a shadow, and the shadow stays there while I type. We're really close to finishing. We just need to add some buttons below the search bar. Let's add a div right below our input, and we'll give it an ID of search buttons. Inside of this div, we're going to add some buttons using the button tag. We just type button, and in this button tag, we specify the text that is on the button. Let's say the first one is Google search, and we'll create another button that says, I'm feeling lucky, just like the main Google website. Let's think ahead. We know that both buttons need to look the same, so we can go ahead and give them the same class. Let's say that the class is search button. We'll copy and paste that for the second one. And note that while the class looks the same as the ID for the outer container, search buttons, this is just search button. Now, since our buttons are in a row, this is something that we should use flex for. We'll apply the same flex property to our search buttons div. Now, to actually get these buttons back towards the center, we can use a separate flex property called justify content. We'll specify that it's in the center, and this will move everything back to the center. The buttons could use some space both around and inside them. Let's add a margin and a padding. We'll specify the class, search button, and we'll specify a margin first. If I use a single number for the margin, this measurement will be applied to all directions. Let's save that. Now let's add a padding. We'll say that it will be 8 pixels vertically and 15 pixels horizontally. Now, when I put my mouse over this button, I notice that the cursor is still an arrow, but I want it to be changed. We can actually use a CSS property to do this. All we have to do is say cursor and then pointer. There's lots of different options that you can use for this. Now when I hover over them, I can see that the cursor is now a hand instead of the default arrow. Before we start styling the buttons more, let's think about different browsers. Buttons are an example of elements that are rendered differently in various browsers. Let's open this exact same website in Firefox. Here we can see that the buttons look clearly different. Let's do the same thing with Safari. Likewise, the buttons look different here as well. To make sure that the buttons look same across the board for everyone, we need to be more specific with our stylings for our button. We can start by setting a standard background color and border. Let's set the background color to a specific CSS hex code that I picked out already. It's F8F9FA. Let's also set a standard border. 1 pixel thick, a solid border, with a color of a dark gray 4B, 4B, 4B. Lastly, let's round out those corners a little bit by giving it a border radius. But this time, we'll just do 4 pixels so that they're slightly rounded. We go back to Google, refresh, and they didn't really change that much in Google Chrome. But if we go to Safari and Mozilla, we can see that now things are starting to look the same. Let's wrap this up by giving it a standard font size of 14 pixels. And we'll add a margin above our container to give some space between the search bar and the buttons. Let's just say that the margin top is 20 pixels. We refresh, and that's looking great. If we visit our other browsers, we see that things are starting to look the exact same across the board, which is what we want. This is called cross-browser compatibility. To wrap things up, let's add a shadow when we hover over the buttons. We'll do this the same as we always have, using the hover pseudo class. So we'll specify the hover pseudo class, and we'll copy and paste the exact same shadow that we've been using for everything else. When we save and refresh, we can see, and now we get that shadow when we hover over our buttons. There's only one thing left to consider, and that's different screen sizes. We haven't talked about this yet, but let's take a look. When we start to shrink our window, we see that the search bar starts to get too long for the screen. When we make websites, we want things to work for all computer screens or phones. We can fix this pretty easily by using something that isn't a static pixel unit. Let's change the width of the search bar to be a percentage of the screen width instead of a single number. We can go back to our width property for our search bar and change it to 90%. This means it'll take up 90% of the width of the screen. When we refresh, we can see that the search bar is really long on a big screen, but it's a perfect size for a small screen. We can fix this by setting a maximum width that the search bar can reach. All we have to do is specify the max width property and set it to 500 pixels, the same width that it was before we started. Now we can see that the bar can only get up to 500 pixels wide, but it will still shrink for smaller screen sizes. Congratulations, we're almost done with phase 1 of this lab. There's still a couple of things that you need to do. Part of this assignment is you need to customize your profile picture. All you need to do is change out the image that we've provided you. Now, you can feel free to customize this page in other ways. For example, you can change the backgrounds, you can change the logos, whatever you want. If you're feeling overwhelmed with all of this, don't worry. You don't need to memorize all those CSS properties that I showed you. You can just look up what you want to do and use the right stuff. This is the conclusion for Phase 1 of Lab01. Phase 2 will be all about customizing this second page. Follow the instructions in the Lab01 PDF to learn more about what you need to do here.